Okay. Am I audible now?
Yes, yes.
Now you're audible, sir.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Firstly, I would like to thank Dr. Sriharsha and Bhargav for organizing such a nice academic events. Thanks to Dr. Sunil Goyal and Dr. Ashish, who have been very kind enough to accept this offer to be a panelist for today's session. Wasting much time, we would like to go and present a few interesting pediatric otolaryngology practice. Okay, will this talk will be directed more towards the practicing who just passed out of their MS, or and for those fellows who are interested in pediatric otolaryngology, this will be more like an approach, a practical situation. This will not be like a theoretical situation. This will be more practical, and we'll be discussing after presenting each case. We will be taking up a Q&A, that is question and answer session, and we'll try to satisfy everyone over here. Okay, so can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Yeah. So do you see my screen?
Yeah, it's visible.
Okay. Now, just give me a second. Yeah. So today we are going to present two cases in pediatric otolaryngology practice. Okay. Our first case would be a case of post-meningitic bilateral profound hearing loss for whom we have done a bilateral simultaneous cochlear implantation. That means cochlear implantation done on both sides in the same sitting. This is done in the youngest child who is aged only 7 months. This is the youngest child to get a bilateral simultaneous implantation in India. Okay. The second case would be a case of laryngomalacia, which is a very common condition associated with subglottic stenosis. We have done supraglottoplasty and subglottic stenosis dilation at the same sitting. Okay, so we'll go on to first case. So this child is a male child who is 7 month old, accompanied by parents. So they have come to our facility with the concerns of child's inability to hear and the inability of the child to make significant progress of the speech. Okay, this is observed for few months following a post meningitic illness. Okay, so the child was treated for meningitis, which was due to pneumococcus, was treated elsewhere medically. The child was in ICU for approximately 3 weeks. So, post discharge, the child was evaluated for hearing by a BERA, where they confirmed that the child had significant hearing loss, that is, profound hearing loss on both sides. So, the child had pneumococcal meningitis, which was the reason for his bilateral profound hearing loss, which was detected at the age of 5 months. And the child presented to us at the age of 7 months. So, the moment the parents and the kid entered our room and gave a significant history, then what we did was we took a elaborated history, then we counseled the caregivers here, the parents, and then we offered them the imaging first before audiology. So in a case of post meningitic deafness, we need to order the imaging at the earliest before any other investigation. So the first is imaging, followed by audiological investigation in detail, and then we are going to plan for a surgery, that is a definitive procedure, and we are going to evaluate the child in a sequential manner and prepare the case for surgery if at all it is feasible. So that was our plan. So we'll go one by one here. Now, in the history, there was nothing significant in the perinatal history. The only significant thing was the child has pneumococcal meningitis treated medically, and at the time of the discharge, hearing screening was done. which confirmed the presence of bilateral profound hearing loss and was advised cochlear implantation at other center. So they came for an expert opinion and the surgical management. So the child has been already, the parents have been already counseled for cochlear implantation. So what we counseled is we reinforced that the decision of going for a cochlear implantation is correct in a given situation, and we would always counsel for a bilateral rather than going for a unilateral cochlear implantation if possible, and that is to restore the near binaural hearing. We can never ever achieve normal hearing. We can try to achieve near normal hearing situation, that too from both ears. If you hear the sound from both ears, that is called as binaural hearing. Okay, we have to check whether the cochlear implantation can be feasible or not. If it has to be feasible, there should be a cochlea, the presence of cochlea, there should be a cochlear lumen into which the electrode should go. If suppose there is any fibrosis or ossification because of the meningitis, you cannot or you may not insert a electrode. So that is not feasible. In such situation, you have to counsel the parents regarding the requirement of auditory brain stem implantation in case the cochlear implantation may not work. So you have to intervene definitely surgery by surgery. And how early should one do is at the earliest. So as early as possible, you should go for a surgical intervention. Having counseled for a bilateral cochlear implantation, it is all about the finances. One has to arrange the finances to afford for a bilateral cochlear implantation. If the parents cannot afford a bilateral or at least a unilateral cochlear implantation, then the idea would be to insert a dummy electrode into the cochlea to maintain the lumen. Once they have the finances, we can always go and remove that dummy electrode and insert a proper ones. So now, once we insert an electrode into the cochlear lumen, the ossification process may still go on, resulting in, just a minute, who's this? There's some problem here. Hello.
Yeah. Please let me know, sir.
There's one lady, I think Chetan Yadav, they permitted for something.
No, you can go ahead, sir.
Just I need to hold on for a second. Yeah, I'm there. So once you do a cochlear implantation dummy, you can always or almost always preserve the cochlear lumen, and you can go for a definitive surgery in case if it is required. When you keep an electrode into the cochlear lumen, still the ossification process can go on in case the disease is active. That means after inserting the cochlear implant electrode into the cochlear lumen, there may be ossification process or fibrosis process around the cochlear electrode, which can impede the electrical distribution. So the electrical distribution from the implant electrode contact towards the spiral ganglion cell population can still be compromised. In such cases where the disease is active, the outcome of the cochlear implantation may be decreased or the outcome may be not good over a period of time. And at one point of time, after it is on an electronic device, it would stop working. After say 20 years or 30 years or 40 years, it would stop working. Then you have to go for a revision cochlear implantation. More so, you have to counsel about the revision cochlear implantation if you are operating on very young individual. Why? Because over a period of time, over a period of his lifetime, the child may require at least one or two revision implantation. So before going for a primary cochlear implantation, you have to counsel the parents regarding the revision cochlear implantation also. Most of the a few people do not counsel such, but revision cochlear implantation should be mentioned here. And if you are going with a thicker electrode in your first or the primary implantation, the revision implantation would be easy with the same thickness or a lesser diameter electrode. That is to be discussed. And the challenges will be discussing in detail. And the prior immunization, there are 3 additional vaccinations that are required before proceeding for any cochlear implantation. Here in our case, the pneumococcal vaccination was already given. The Haemophilus influenza type B vaccine has been postponed as per the pediatrician's advice, and the meningococcal vaccine was not given. Why? Because this the causative organism for this case for meningitis is Streptococcus pneumoniae. The other organisms may be Neisseria or it can be Haemophilus influenza. In our case, it was proven case of pneumococcal meningitis. So the first investigation what we would order is a radiological investigation, and that too a MRI is preferred if you have to go for a unilateral modality or unilateral imaging modality. And if you go for bimodal way of imaging, you have to go for both MRI and CT scan. But the preferred ones in a post meningitic event is always MRI over CT. Now, in this cut here, this is a T2 weighted image MRI axial section showing the cochlea here. This is the basal turn of the cochlea. Here the signal intensity is lost here. The hyperintensivity of the normal perilymphatic space is lost because the perilymphatic fluid has been compromised in the scala tympani of the basal turn because of maybe fibrosis or ossification. So if there is an ossification, it would be visible on a CT. But if it is only fibrosis, it would not be visible on CT scan. It would be visible only as a loss of hyperintensity signal in the MRI. Here you can see the loss of fluid or hyperintense signal in the both cochleae in the basal turn of the basal scala tympani. So now coming to the classification, what is the classification for this cochlear or labyrinthitis ossification? So this ossification, LO, is nothing but labyrinthitis ossification classification is given by Balcony. So it is divided into C0, C1, C2 and C3. C0 means the lumen is very much normal. C1 means the ossification or fibrosis up to only the initial basal turn scala tympani or along the basal turn of the cochlea, not extending up to the middle turn. If it extends into the middle turn, or if there are skip lesions like thing or skip ossification extending beyond the second turn, it would be C2, and C3 is total ossification. Okay, in this case it is between C1 and C2. So in the surgery we may encounter fibrosis or bone only in the basal turn. If we can clear this fibrosis or ossification, we are going to get the lumen and we can insert our electrode. That is our idea, and that is how we interpret the scans. The next would be a audiological investigation. This would be more for a documentation purpose. Though the child is 7 months in our case, we went with a behavioral observational audiometry. You can also go with VRA, that is visual reinforcement audiometry. In our case, we opted for behavioral observational audiometry. There were no responses. Impedance audiometry showed bilateral A-type curve tympanogram with reflexes bilateral absent. That means the middle ear is normal, but there may be a problem in the inner ear because your reflexes are absent. We opted for a distortion product otoacoustic emissions, which was bilateral refer that indicates the outer hair cell function is at compromise. We opted for ABR, which is the confirmatory test here. it proved that there are no identifiable peak 5 till 90 dB normated hearing level. So that confirms the profound hearing loss on both sides, and that fits the audiological criteria for the cochlear implantation. The extra investigation which people might think is ASSR, that is auditory steady state response. As a routine, as a protocol in our institution, we go ahead with ASSR. Why? In a case of post meningitic deafness, what happens is the ossification process or the fibrosis process starts in the scala tympani of the basal tongue near the opening of the cochlear aqueduct. It would be approximately 6 millimeters from the ground window membrane, approximately. So the cochlear aqueduct connects the subarachnoid space and the basal tongue of the cochlea, scala tympani. So the infection from the subarachnoid space goes into the scala tympani of the basal tongue. So the infection or the inflammation or the disease process or the pathology process starts in the basal tongue of the cochlea and goes towards the apex. Suppose, as in our case, this pathology has involved only the basal turn of the cochlea. If it is not involving the middle or the apical turns, that frequencies can be preserved. That can be known by ASSR. Suppose the ASSR gives a residual hearing in the lower frequencies, that means the disease did not go up to the level of the apical turn of the cochlea. That is the reason why we opted for a ASSR, which may give you an idea if the residual hearing in the lower frequencies is present or not, so that you can choose an electrode accordingly. So ASSR is mandatory at our center, and in our case, in this case, there was no residual hearing. So that means we have to stimulate all the frequencies possible. Now, aided thresholds were not done considering his age, and the speech and evaluation, language evaluation was also not done considering his age. Now, what are the challenges in this case? What is the necessity of presenting this case? Such a young child, 7-month-old, being planned for a bilateral simultaneous cochlear implantation. So, the cochlear implantation can be done in pediatric individuals under anesthesia, which is usually general. So if you have to operate on such young individual and give anesthesia for approximately say 3 to 4 hours, there will definitely be some anesthetic consideration which have to be taken into considered. Sorry. Now, very young individual, he may not tolerate hypothermia. That is the thing to worry about, and the surgical time should also be shortened. The time or the cutoff time given to operate 7-month-old child would be 3 to 4 hours. If you have to extend your surgical time, you have to go for unilateral implantation rather than going for a bilateral implantation. In our case, we did this bilateral simultaneous implantation skin to skin 3 hours, so 1.5 hours on each side. Now, the child is only 7.5 kg weight, and considering his weight, you can't afford to lose blood. Okay, we have seen that there is a marrow bone in the mastoid on both sides. So there is a chance that when you do a mastoidectomy, there could be more bleeding because there will be more marrow bone. So in such case, to prevent the blood loss, you should be using a diamond birth from the start if required. And that blood loss should be very, very, very minimal. Next, once you have a post meningitic event, you may or may not be able to introduce the electrode into the cochlear lumen. So that is a challenge. If suppose you have inserted the electrode into the cochlear lumen, because of the fibrosis process or because of the loss of the perilymphatic fluid, your electrophysiological testing may not be proper or may not be giving a good result. The electrode impedances may be high, the telemetry or the ECAP measurements might not be that good to accept. Post implantation, if you are doing a bilateral implantation, you should not, or you prefer not to map the implants simultaneously. So it is first switch on one side, give some time, again switch to the other implant and then synchronize it. That is the way you map for a bilateral simultaneous. The rehabilitation process is actually not a challenge in such a young individual. A young individual doesn't actually need a active habilitation program. Why? Because the child will develop naturally if the child is operated at a younger age. Now, the revision implantation, though it may be done after say 10 or 15 or 20 or 30 years, still will be a challenge. Why? Because you have to go with a electrode which is the same diameter or the lesser diameter in the revision implantation. So the first surgery has to be proper, as the second surgery would be easier comparatively. The last thing, which is actually considered to be a support rather than a challenge, is your implant manufacturing company support. Suppose you are not able to insert the electrode, will the company be giving you another electrode, or they don't charge you? That you have to talk to the manufacturing company. In our case, we are very fortunate that Advanced Bionics has come up with a great support, and they gave us a dummy electrode to assess whether the cochlear implant electrode can be really inserted into the lumen in case if there is any fibrosis or ossification process which can be encountered. The other thing what I would like to mention about the support is your mentor support. This would be a real boost to you. In our case, Dr. Neelam Vaid was there with us. I really thank her a lot for all the support she has provided through years. Now, this is just a surgical clipping here, and this is the left side cochlear implantation. This is the posterior tympanotomy. It should be as wide as possible, and one should be exposing the round window membrane like this. So, in such a young individual, what care is to be taken starting from your incision? The incision should be a little bit straighter and little bit superior to avoid the mastoid. When you incise the skin and the soft tissue, you should not keep much pressure onto the knife to prevent injury to the facial nerve, if at all it is very superficial. The pneumatization of the mastoid should be assessed by imaging beforehand. And if you have a lot of marrow, as in this case, we prefer to do with a diamond burr from the start. And the posterior tympanotomy should be as wide as possible. It is always preferable to expose the stapes, and you identify the round window membrane inferiorly and posteriorly to it. Once you identify the round window membrane, depending upon your electrode and depending upon your imaging findings, you have to design the approach of cochlear implantation. In our case, we know that we are going to encounter definitely a fibrosis or a bone or ossification process which we are going to deal. So we did not opt to go with a round window approach. We opted for a extended round window approach where we drilled this area anterior inferior or more inferior and then anterior to the round window membrane. So this is how we drill it, okay, anteriorly, and then we remove the anterior and inferior margin or extend the anterior and inferior margin of the round window membrane, and then we went with a Advanced Bionics 90K Advantage implant with a 1J electrode. Why did we opt for a 1J electrode? This is number one. This is a lateral wall electrode. That means it will be hugging the lateral side of the cochlea. It is a curved electrode which will go into the cochlear lumen much easily and it will follow the curvature of the cochlea. Number 3, it is a perimodular electrode. So, sorry, the electrode has got a contacts which would be directed towards the modulus. Here we don't want the current to distribute on the other sides. We want the current towards the modulus or the spiral ganglion cell population. And this is the thickest electrode with these features among the ones which is manufactured by Advanced Bionics. The others are mid-scalar electrode, and the other one, new one, is the Slim J electrode. This is one of the thickest electrode in Advanced Bionics company. So having a lateral wall electrode, the electrode contacts directed towards the modulus, having an appropriate diameter. It is 0.4 millimeters at the apex and 0.6 millimeter at the base, which can be inserted to the extended round window member. This is the reason why we opted for a 1J electrode. So if you have to opt for another electrode, we would always prefer the thicker electrodes, be it in Medal or Cochlear company. Opt for a thicker electrode so that the electrode will maintain the cochlear lumen even if there is any fibrosis or ossification, and the revision implantation would be easier. Now, this is how we document. This surgery took place in 2019 March 21st, and this is how we document. What we write here is what is the indication, what is the imaging findings, the audiology, and what is the vaccination given, and then the surgical procedure, which will include everything in detail. What are the intraoperative drugs and electrophysiological things, and postoperatively, what is the electrode position. And we also strictly mention about the warnings, what to do, what not to do, and when to report immediately. And there will be definitely an undertaking which will be signed by usually the parents or the caregivers, promising that the child will go for rehabilitation process post surgery. So this copy would be with us, that is the surgeon, with the parents, and also with the hospital. This is how we maintain. Now, intraoperatively in theater, we have to confirm whether the electrode is intracochlearly properly placed here. This is the intense imaging in the theater. Okay, before extubating the child, we have to go for a X-ray, check X-ray. So this is the intraoperative picture, and this is the post-operative picture day 1. Okay, this is a proper X-ray which where you can see the electrode here and here. Okay, so this is more clear here. You can even count the number of the electrodes. So the insertion of the electrode is very proper here, and the insertion depth angle is approximately 420 degree, so which is within the range of the 1J electrode. And here one can argue that this implant is not exactly at the place of the plane of this implant. It appears as though this implant is placed downwards and this implant is placed upwards. Ideally, both should lie at the same level. This is only an illusion. This is because of the improper positioning of the child during an X-ray. We'll show you post-operative picture. Both the implants were seated at the same position or the same level. That will confirm in next picture. Okay. So how did we manage this kid? Immediately after surgery, we shifted this child and nursed in pediatric intensive care unit for 1 day, where the child experienced cyanotic spells on the day 0 of surgery. So these were noted to be very common when the anesthesia is given to such young individual. The child is happily discharged on day 1 postoperatively after the X-ray is confirmed. So 3 weeks post-operatively after the skin incision and the soft tissues has been healed, then we went on and connected the external speech processor and switched on the implant. So this is the right side and this is the left side, and now you can see which is a thing different. This both implants are sitting at the same level. This is how one should plan when you are doing a bilateral implantation. So after switch on, the child was on regular habilitation process, which is after usually the first week and then 15 days, 1 month follow up for next 3 months, and there 2 monthly for up to 6 months, and then 6 monthly up to 1 year or 2 years, and there 1 year later on. Okay, so this I can't show you. Why? Because the parents doesn't want this child to get exposed, so that is the reason why we block this. These are actually the videos which will indicate the performance details. So this is how we map, and what we have to check after implantation is whether the electrode impedances is the same or it has been increased over a period of time. Say the cochlear fibrosis or the ossification process, if it goes on, the pathology goes on, these electrode impedances will go high. That is an indication the disease process is active. And these are our current levels here. And this is how we maintain a record of the history. Okay, how the child is being doing. Now, I would like to thank our team, our mentor. Personally, I would like to thank Dr. Neelam Vaid here and Dr. Manu, my colleague, and the entire team here, Dr. Sai and Garima, for associating with us. This is our youngest team here, and we are very proud that we are the first pediatric hospital to offer an exclusive pediatric cochlear implantation program. None of our team members have crossed 40 when we started the implantation program. So we were the youngest cochlear implant team in India, and we were both surgeons, myself and Manu, are the only certified fellows in implantology from India. The first ones when we started this implantation program, and this child is the youngest child in India to get a bilateral simultaneous cochlear implantation with the AB1J electrode. So this is about us. So the first case finishes here. I'd be more than happy to answer any questions related to bilateral simultaneous cochlear implantation. Dr. Sunil?
Thank you, Dr. Kiran. It was an excellent presentation and a very well managed patient.
Yeah.
There are few questions from the participants. One question is, how would you follow up a post-meningitis child with a mild or moderate hearing loss?
Okay, great question. So if you have a post-meningitic child who has got mild to moderate, whether the child is doing well with the speech acquisition or not is the one which you need to see. If the child is too young and still in the speech acquisition period, so the speech, whenever it is compromised, then you have to again image it. So there is no time frame that the post meningitic event will lead to profound hearing loss. So the child has to be evaluated for the speech and language acquisition in case if the child is
हेलो
in the speech acquisition period. If the child
मैं एक मीटिंग में रहता हूँ, मैं बाद में बात करता हूँ.
if the speech acquisition period is already over, that is over 7 years of age, we would still do a hearing screening every 6 monthly or 1 yearly for at least 2 or 3 years. In case if it is not being compromised, then we can manage with a hearing aid possibly.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Kiran. There is another question.
Yeah, I would like to add one more thing, Sunil. If it is a asymmetrical hearing loss, it depends on how to proceed depending upon the hearing on one side. If one side is profound and the other side is normal, you can always go with the implantation on one side, or you can opt for Baha or cross hearing aid. Okay, if it is bilateral, again you follow up if it is mild to moderate hearing loss with a hearing aid again, once again.
Right. So sequential MRI scan is very important to follow up the progress of the ossificans, whether any fibrosis is setting in, and if we feel that it is going to be compromised, then we may have to put at least a test electrode in for the time being where the child is having some reasonable hearing and benefiting with a hearing aid.
Yes. So
Other question is, in a simultaneous bilateral CI, do we have a preference of switch on and spur handedness?
no, no, there's no preference as such, but always try to implant a better ear, okay,
Yeah.
which is
If you're planning,
surgically and audiologically better.
if
Okay,
you're planning for a unilateral implant, then always the better ear in.
better ear to implant. Yes.
Uh, Another question is whether revision CI is required for all cases of CI done at early age, and what is the approximate lifespan of a CI?
Mostly, yes. Yes. If the child has been implanted at a very young age, most likely the child would require a revision implantation. Okay. The lifetime of the implant by the implant manufacturing company is 10 years. 10 years doesn't mean that the implant will go off or switched off after 10 years of age. So it depends if upon the residual hearing. It depends whether the child is implanted on one side or both sides. If both sides are implant, the requirement of the revision implantation will come late. So minimum would be 10 years. It may extend up to 40 years.
Yeah, and there are studies, just to add on a point to what you said,
Yes.
which have done studies on determining the cumulative survival rates of an implant. They have studied the implants over 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and they have found
Yes.
most of the three US FDA approved implants have a CSR of more than 90%. So more than 90% would be active up to say 15 to 20 years.
Yes. Agree.
There's another question. This is regarding the present case of meningitis. So, one of the participants is asking, kindly repeat again how you detect ongoing process of meningitis ossificans.
Post implantation, do you mean to say?
No, they're asking for pre-implantation. How do you detect ongoing process of meningitis ossificans?
Immediately?
Post-meningitis.
I didn't.
Post-meningitis ossificans, how do you follow it up?
Okay, post meningitis ossification. If it is in, see, the best thing is to go for a MRI, titulated image. So if the fluid signal is lost, that means the fibrosis or ossification is setting in. So then, if you suspect that the hearing is also going down, that means you go for a CT scan also, where you check whether it is only ossification or fibrosis, and you have to go for a immediate implantation definitely.
Right. There's another question regarding bilateral CI. So he's asking, what are the arguments in support and against a bilateral CI? So
Great question.
just add on another question. What would be an absolute indication for bilateral CI where you would not like to wait?
Okay, absolute indication and the advantages of bilateral.
Advantage
Okay,
and disadvantage.
yeah. See, absolute indication, there's nothing like that, but in abroad, in other countries or in advanced countries, the bilateral cochlear implantation is a mandate. The only thing which is stopping you from doing a bilateral cochlear implantation in our situation is the finances. The contraindication of doing a bilateral simultaneous implantation is the advancement of the technology. In case if you think that the technology is going to improve over a period of time, then you are against the bilateral cochlear implantation. But there is nothing like an absolute indication or absolute contraindication for a bilateral implantation. And outside or in other developed countries, a bilateral cochlear implantation is a mandate. We are not doing it because we don't have finances. Now, coming to the bilateral implantation advantages, number one would be a sound localization. Sound localization would be good or better as compared to unilateral cochlear implantation, number one. Number two, the music appreciation would be good. Number three, the child will be acquiring the speech and the language much faster as compared to unilateral cochlear implantation. These are the three major advantages of bilateral cochlear implantation.
There's another question on meningitis. Can you throw a light on progress of ossificans post CI in meningitis child? Any literature regarding the same?
Literature I can always share with Harsha, who can always forward it. There are a lot of studies on post meningitis events. There are also labyrinthitis ossification or meningitis following a normal cochlear implantation. That can be prevented by vaccination, that is pneumococcal, meningococcal, and H influenza vaccination. So, post meningitis, the ossification process can start within hours or days and can extend up to nearly 15 or 20 years after the meningitic event. So there is a very, very, very large range of duration where the meningitis event can lead to ossification or fibrosis. That's it.
I think we can, that's enough for the day, and we have further discussion on it sometime later again.
Sure.
And should we move to the second presentation?
Yeah, I mean, it's up to you.
Yeah, I think so. Ashish, Dr. Ashish.
Sir, you can go ahead, sir, with second presentation.
Okay, fine. Thanks, Sunil. If there are any questions, I would like to take up if there are any after the end of this talk. I would still be happy to answer if there are any questions. Now, we'll quickly move on to the second case here. So, the second case is a case of laryngomalacia with subglottic stenosis in a 6-day-old child, who is a male once again. This child came to us on day 3 of life. So the parents accompanied the child and they presented to our facility with the child's complaint of respiratory distress, noisy breathing, that is stridor, since birth. So immediately after birth, the child was intubated. Okay, intubated elsewhere, and they were referred to a higher center. So the moment the child had a history of respiratory distress immediately after birth, the child was intubated and the child was on a ventilatory support. So we counseled the parents for a further investigation, that is a fiber optic laryngoscopy, that is microlaryngoscopy, and also bronchoscopy to see whether the airway lesion is extending lower down or more distally. We want to go for a full surgical profile and also the cross consultation, and we would like to plan for a definitive procedure. So, the history suggested that the respiratory distress was very intense in a term child, and the intubation was done immediately after birth. So, the oxygen saturation was falling below 85%. So, to maintain a SpO2, the child was intubated immediately. To prevent the micro aspirations, the child was even on a gastric tube. The pediatrician has advised, or the neonatologist has advised, for a cardiac and neurological consult, which revealed to be clinically normal. No investigations were done except for a 2D echocardiography, which was normal. A genetic screening or the genetic disorders were not evaluated in this situation. We counsel the parents for the need for a diagnostic endoscopy to establish a diagnosis which is related to the airway. Most likely would be a laryngomalacia, but it has to be evaluated and confirmed, and the other or the synchronous airway lesions should be ruled out before proceeding on to a definitive procedure. So no imaging was actually required to make a diagnosis of laryngomalacia or synchronous airway lesion other than endoscopy. So we did not opt for a CT scan or a MRI scan in this situation. Though they are mentioned, the gold standard would be direct visualization of the laryngeal interior. So this was the situation when the child was born, and this was on day 1. Okay, so you see there is respiratory distress. The child was on support, the gastric tube, And this was on day 2. There is suprasternal and also the biphoid thing, and also retractions in the subcostal region. The chest retractions are all there, significant with the diagnosis of a laryngomalacia. Now, what we did was we did a laryngoscopy here and also a tracheoscopy and bronchoscopy. We call it as microlaryngoscopy and bronchoscopy. Though it is not the only way to diagnose, that which is the proper way. What we see here is nothing but some polypoidal thing here on the left vocal cord, which might be due to the intubation, and we also see some sort of a stenosis here in the subglottic region. So what are the things we have noticed here? Number one, the epiglottis is a little bit large and curled on itself here. The arytenoids are here. The redundant mucosa or the arytenoids and the corniculate cartilage here, which was prolapsed into anteromedial direction. The vocal cord appears to be very much normal, and there's a subglottic stenosis. So, depending upon the Olney classification, the laryngomalacia is divided into three types: type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 1 is nothing but the prolapsed mucosa or the redundant mucosa over the arytenoids or over the cartilages here. And the second is nothing but the foreshortening of the aryepiglottic folds here. And the third would be a posterior displacement. This is anterior, this is posterior. If the epiglottis falls posteriorly and obstructs the laryngeal inlet, that is called as a type 3 laryngomalacia. Most often, the most common presentation of laryngomalacia will be with a type 1. The next common presentation would be a combination of either type 2 with type 1 or type 1 with type 3. This is a combination. And a few of the laryngomalacia cases can also have synchronous airway lesions. Most commonly, the laryngomalacia can be associated with tracheomalacia or bronchiomalacia, and the next possibility is the subglottic stenosis. The subglottic stenosis, again, classification is given by Mayer-Cottens. Grade 1 is the luminal obstruction is less than 50, that is 0 to 50 is grade 1. Grade 2 is 51 to 70, grade 3 is 71 to 99, and grade 4 is total obstruction. So this falls somewhere around between 1 and 2. So we have to address the laryngomalacia and we have to address the subglottic stenosis here. So, sorry. So what are the challenges in this case? So again, the anesthetic consideration should be given in a very young individual. Usually there will not be any blood loss if you operate with proper care. If the dissection goes laterally, the epiglottic folds, there is a chance of blood loss, but otherwise it should not be here. And the surgical time will be decided by the patient himself or the kid himself. So if the child can tolerate the hypopnea or apnea for more time, you will have more time to operate. Otherwise, you have to stop, again give oxygen supply, and again do a procedure if at all it is required. The instrumentation would be a little bit difficult in such an young individual. There are chances of restenosis in case if you do anything with the subglottic stenosis thing. There is a there may be a need for a revision dilatation in case you proceed with a dilatation procedure. There is steroid use and the proton pump inhibitor use post-surgical procedure is questionable. That we'll discuss in detail. And the support from the pediatric anesthetic team. Okay. So we have decided to do a supraglottoplasty for moderate to severe laryngomalacia and also the subglottic stenosis dilation. So there are lot many ways of doing a supraglottoplasty. So which is described by Prescott, that is nothing but the wedge excision of the aryepiglottic folds, and the balloon dilatation is given by Hebra et al. Okay, so you can do it with a conventional cold steel instrumentation with the scissors, or you can opt for laser, or you can go with a coblation technique. We have opted here for a coblation technique here. We chose a laryngeal wand which is available as ProSize MLW wand, which has got a setting of 7-3, that is coagulation and coagulation. So we have chosen this way of doing a supraglottoplasty. So for the subglottic stenosis, we opted for a balloon dilatation procedure. So this is the Merrill Company balloon here. So having taken the age of the child, so the appropriate diameter or the recommended diameter of the balloon, this diameter would be less than 6 millimeters, that is 5 millimeters. Commercially available elsewhere would be 6 millimeters. In India, it is available as 5 millimeters. So the length of this balloon maximum is 24 millimeters and the diameter is 5 millimeters. This balloon can be inflated with saline with the help of something called as an inflator. This is also commercially available. So this is connected to this area. There is a three-way cannula like thing. First, there's a locking system here. We need to take a normal saline here, remove the air bubbles, and then lock it, and then inflate the balloon with normal saline. So how much inflation you require depends upon the stenosis, and you have to hold that high pressure for a period approximately 30 seconds. So if you allow the SpO2 to fall below 92%, then it is not correct. So you should see to it that oxygen saturation should not fall below 92% and maximum is 30 seconds. So if the child can tolerate the lower level of oxygen only for say 10 seconds, we need to stop, do something, give air, and then again reinsert the balloon, but that would not be recommended here. Okay, the more you reinsert, the more chances of injury, and the more chances of bleeding, the more chances of restenosis or fibrosis. So there is one good paper here. Okay, so our child was between this bracket. So our child was not a premature individual, and the child was having a normal birth weight. So the child is also not of a less weight. So he was in this bracket, the 0 to 3 months age bracket, and the intubation tube was somewhere around 3 millimeters in a diameter, and the size which we opt for is nothing but a 6 millimeter balloon catheter. Okay, we opted for a 5 millimeter here, but the outside you can get a 6 millimeter diameter balloon. So this is the epiglottic fold here. The epiglottis is curled like that. This is the pharyngoepiglottic folds. This should never be cut. If you have to cut, you have to cut here. So these are resected with the help of the scissors. Here in our case, we went with a MLW and ProSize. So we have made a cut such that this curled epiglottis is opened up, opening the laryngeal airway or the inlet with the endotracheal tube in situ. The idea of doing this with the endotracheal tube in situ is, in case if you have to coagulate this redundant glucosa over the arytenoids, you should never excise or reduce the redundant mucosa in the midline or the interarytenoid region, which may result in restenosis posteriorly. There might be adhesions. So that is not recommended. If you keep the endotracheal tube in situ, it will prevent your restenosis. Why? Because you will not be able to enter this area in case if you are not interested in. Okay, so the redundant mucosa over the arytenoids is removed, and then we introduce the balloon catheter into the subglottic stenosis area and dilate it. This was the bleeding which we encountered. Why? Because the dissection was a little bit lateral, and this was controlled fortunately with the same wand, MW wand. So this is the video, a short video here, where we are trying to resect the aryepiglottic folds here, which are very tight, holding the epiglottis over the laryngeal inlet here. Okay, so this is the second video here. Just completing the procedure, and this is about the subglottic stenosis dilation, introducing the balloon catheter. The moment you introduce your balloon catheter, the endotracheal tube comes out, because you can't introduce both at the same time here. Okay, and then you dilate it for a few seconds. In our case, we dilated it for 25 seconds. Why? Because the oxygen saturation was dropping down. So post-operatively, this was on day 2 after extubation. The extubation wasn't planned immediately. There are situations where we can extubate immediately after the procedure, but the extubation will be postponed for at least 2 days. The child is nursed in NICU with the endotracheal tube in situ. Why? Because there are situations where the child can have some uneventful cardiac events, such that there can be some cardiac arrest also. There can be associated cardiac anomalies also. All this is a neuromuscular problem. So this child is intubated for 2 days, and then on day 2 we extubated the child. The child was on nasal oxygen with a flow rate of 1 liter, and the epinephrine nebulization has been given. Now, the child was discharged on day 4 with some advice to the parent, the mother. So we advised how to feed the child. The feeding should be in an upright position. The feeding should be intermittent. Should not feed the child much at the same sitting. So small short feeds to be given at regular intervals. Immediately after feeding, one should always advise burping. And the consistency of the food is recommended to be thick, but in such a situation, you can't say something about consistency of the food here. The postural advice as how to nurse the child. The child is advised to be nursed in a head up posture, preferably approximately 30 to 45 degrees, or you can get a slant where you can nurse the child. Now, a question about whether to start a proton pump inhibitor or an anti-reflux medication. The options here would be a ranitidine and also omeprazole. Omeprazole can be given approximately 0.7 milligram per kg, and it can be given as a single dose. But if at all, if you start omeprazole in a preterm individual, there are chances that it could land in necrotizing enterocolitis. So our neonatologist did not recommend the anti-reflux medication. He did not even give the omeprazole, and saying that the child should turn at least 1 month before you attempt to give a proton pump inhibitor. So there are plus for and against arguments, but in our case, we did not give omeprazole. We are about to start after 1 month postoperatively, so 1 month of age. Now, the anti-reflux measures have been advised to the mother to feed the child in an upright position, and the steroid usage post-operatively is also questionable. One can opt for a hydrocortisone, or one can also opt for dexamethasone, approximately 0.25 milligram per kg per dose in 3 divided doses or 8 hourly. It should be given at least, the first dose should be given at least 4 hours before the planned extubation or scheduled extubation. And we assured the parents that this condition is going to improve, but the drastic change can be observed over a period of time as the child gains weight. So this is a paper on whether to use the proton pump inhibitors, and this paper says that there is no evidence that this is recommended. The empirical anti-reflux medication may not be given and may not be the first choice for the treatment here to prevent GERD. Why? Because the GERD is an aggravating factor of laryngomalacia. The more the GERD, the mucosa over the posterior larynx will get irritated, and again will increase the severity of laryngomalacia. So to prevent that, a few people do give anti-reflux medication, but it should be given with caution in very young individual like this. The next is about the use of the corticosteroids. And there is one more paper here which says that there is no actual benefit of the steroids, but you can still give. Okay. Now the child has been not given any omeprazole or dexamethasone. Why? Because the child is still due for a visit. So the child is not even 1 month old till date. So he's on regular follow-up. He's doing good, which video have been shown here. And we are planning to get a gastroenterologist opinion, pediatric gastroenterology opinion regarding his advice whether to go with a proton pump inhibitor post-operatively to prevent the reflux. So this is all we have, and I would like to take any questions if at all there are any.
Thank you so much, Satya sir. That was a very elaborate and neatly presented case. Dr. Srinivas Kishore sir and Dr. Vidyasagar sir are online. First of all, I would request them to share their thoughts on this case, and
they are experts in this field.
Yeah, that's why.
Sir, good evening to Dr. Srinivas sir and Dr. Vidyasagar.
Hi, Satya. It's a fantastic presentation. I think, of course, the first presentation just went all over my head like a Raphael. But I probably have a couple of points to sort of ask you a little later. Let Sagar speak, and then probably I'll put in my inputs as well.
Sure.
But I would first like to congratulate you on a job well done.
Hi, Srinivas.
Hi, man.
That was very diplomatic. Okay, Satya, very well done. Very, very nicely done. Excellent cases. Dealt very nicely.
So that's all of your, I mean, that's the inspiration from you all people actually.
Come on. Very nicely done.
Sir, and
You justified each and everything with good literature review also. But since it is more of a practical concept that Shriyas was talking about, in this second particular case, I want to add few points. Number one, I mean, I'm not sure whether first of all, very nicely done. Very nicely done. You managed the symbiotic stenosis very nicely.
I'm not able to hear. Is there any problem with
There's a
the
lot of audio disturbance.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes, sir. There was a disturbance.
Okay, now it is better, I think.
Yes, sir.
So very nicely done.
Yeah.
I believe it is very difficult for me to analyze the pixelated video image to comment about the laryngomalacia that was present in this particular patient. But I believe, I may be wrong in it because I didn't see the patient in toto. It is the surgeon's take on seeing the MLB or DLB that matters more than seeing the video in a video presentation.
Exactly.
So what you made the judgment is based on your view there. So I totally agree with your judgment. But from what I see, I think it is more like the subglottic stenosis to be the main cause rather than the laryngomalacia, at least in this case.
Okay.
So I may be wrong because I couldn't see the dynamicity of the collapse in the video that I see because due to the bandwidth, maybe the collapsibility part gets shrunk with the, pixelation or something. So I'm not sure about the laryngomalacia component, but having said that, if it was what was there, then I think you addressed it very nicely.
Okay.
So congratulations for that.
Thank you.
And regarding the second part, I was in and out, sorry, but for the subglottic stenosis, did you do only the balloon dilatation or did you do anything in addition for that?
No.
And before I asked that, was it more of a membranous or was it a little firm, or
No, it was just
how was the? It was membranous.
Yes.
Then, if it was membranous, then what you did is the best treatment.
Yes.
And just post-operatively, if you follow it and do a flexible scopy to see that it doesn't come back or recur, then I think that's the way it should be. And you have managed it beautifully. Let's hear from Srinivas Kishore.
Yes. So one thing you rightly mentioned, it's not actually the static image, it's actually the dynamic function has to be evaluated. And
Exactly.
to do it in an awake patient, that is more clear than doing in a sedated child.
Yes. Yes, totally agree. Totally agree with this statement. Yes.
Yeah.
So I think you would have done a FLB or a FLP before, and
Yes.
based on that, you would have taken a judgment of supraglottoplasty or epiglotoplasty.
Yes.
So if that is so, yes, very nicely done. Let's hear from Srinivas also.
Yes, sir.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes,
Am
sir.
am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So, Satya, basically, I think I would probably echo what Sagar has said. So, let me play the devil's advocate here. Okay. And probably it's a very rhetorical question. I also possibly think that, in a days-old child,
Okay.
usually laryngomalacia doesn't present by itself,
Yes.
because laryngomalacia is actually based on the newer theories that we are all aware of. It is more of a neuromuscular problem than what we used to think before.
Yes.
Thinking of it was a lax hyoepiglottic ligament and things like that.
Yes.
So when there is a distal obstruction,
Yes.
the supraglottis is possibly a consequence of the subglottic obstruction. So maybe dilating the subglottic stenosis, which is, I see that based on the images that you showed me, it looked like a Cotton-Mayer 2, isn't
Okay.
it?
Yeah, more than 51%.
Yeah, so it's a Cotton-Mayer 2 and a McCaffrey stage 2.
Yeah.
So I think that is a fantastic call as far as the subglottis is concerned. But probably we need to be very careful when you do synchronous conditions, yes, together in a very tiny larynx,
Yes.
especially when you are adopting a hot technique.
Yes.
If you'd have taken a scissors and snipped it off, as opposed to maybe using a coblation. But having said that, coblation is a wonderful tool to, as opposed to a laser in the supraglottic area, primarily because the damage and collateral damage is less. Well, this discussion is not about that, but I think maybe what you have done is brilliant, and we've also shown that you have to cut very close to the epiglottis and not close to the arytenoid, because again that would lead into what we call as posterior glottic stenosis, and that would spill into the interarytenoid area and cause more problems. So yeah, I think that's my 5 paisa worth of knowledge, if I can put in there.
Very nicely put, Srinivas. Very nicely put. I would strongly echo your thoughts on it. I was about to say the same, but without seeing the actual thing, I couldn't comment so strongly. But you put it very nicely.
And then the other issue is only that any mellitic lesion, it is better to do an FLP. Okay, it's done as in an FLP, because the moment you put a rigid a laryngoscope, you are already stenting that area, and the dynamics have completely changed.
Yes.
So that's another point. Yeah, that's the only.
In a synchronous airway lesion, the proximal pathology will be more exaggerated because of the Venturi effect and
Bernoulli's phenomenon. Exactly.
Thank you very much.
But having said that, you did very nicely address the subglottic area very, very nicely. I'm so happy that you took care of that part very, very nicely, elegantly. Thank you.
Thanks.
Anybody else has any questions? So I think probably anybody else has got some questions. Maybe it'll be a good, healthy discussion to have.
Yeah, please.
Organizers, hello.
Yeah,
Yeah, I would like to put forth a few points if I'm allowed.
yes, please
If
go
the time. So basically, this case is like a typical presentation. Laryngomalacia is in a male child. It's more common in males. And usually, as Dr. Srinivas Kishore sir said, if it was isolated laryngomalacia, it would not have presented immediately post birth. Probably usually, like theoretically, they say it presents around 1 or 2 weeks and it gets better by 18 months. So that's what is. It peaks at around 8 to 9 months and it resolves on its own if left untreated at 18 months. So probably because of this subglottic stenosis, whatever mild laryngomalacia was there due to the sucking effect, probably the altered aerodynamics led to present it more pronouncedly. Okay, so as Srinivas Kishore sir said, it is more of a neuromuscular disturbance due to the altered laryngeal adductor reflexes and decreased sensory output to the brain, and that will cause the lowering of threshold, and that neuromuscular discoordination will lead to laryngomalacia. And one thing sir was mentioning is a dynamic evaluation of the larynx.
exactly.
Nasopharyngolaryngoscopy, not in the OPD, but even in OT, before you venture into operating, we might as well evaluate a dynamic evaluation of larynx can be done using a total intravenous anesthesia. You keep the child on spontaneous ventilation, spontaneous breathing. You keep the child on spontaneous breathing, and you can always do a flexible laryngoscopy where the dynamic, we will be able to evaluate the dynamics of the supraglottis. That is one thing I wanted to add. And regarding the anti-reflux measures, there is a lot of debate on that, definitely. But few studies, they say ranitidine is a better option compared to PPIs in a dose of around 1 to 2 mg per kg per dosage. So that is again a controversial thing, and omeprazole, lansoprazole, they say is better than omeprazole. So that is left to the discretion of the surgeon and the gastroenterology who is consulting. And there are few points put out in the chat by Dr. PVLN Murthy sir. Sir was suggesting it was better to use a bigger balloon rather than using a 5 mm balloon. It's better to use a 6 or 7 mm balloon. That's what sir is suggesting.
Yeah, take your time. Thank you.
Sir, there is one question from Dr. Shalu Sharma.
Yeah.
What was the grading you have followed while performing this surgery? What was the grading?
So for the laryngomalacia, it was always grading, and for the subglottic stenosis, again, it's a Mayer-Cotton's classification. I would also like to say that the laryngeotracheal stenosis can also be classified according to the European Society of European Laryngology Society, and Lorenberg laryngomalacia classification system is also available for laryngomalacia, and there's also modified Allens classification. So we have followed Allens classification and Cotton-Mayer's.
Okay, if I may add one more point, sir.
Please.
Like coming to the subglottic stenosis, laryngomalacia is Olney's, and one more is Hollinger, but Olney's is widely accepted. Coming to subglottic stenosis, sir. Yeah. Cotton-Mayer's is again the widely accepted one, but one drawback for Cotton-Mayer is it doesn't consider the vertical extent of the stenosis. So there is one McAfee's grading where they consider the length of the stenosis. But if it is a membrane, you can clearly see it is a membranous stenosis, membranous stenosis. So it won't be more than one, and endoscopic correction would be the ideal thing to do if it is 1 centimeter, if it is a less than 1 centimeter thickness stenosis. And sir, do you consider giving incisions on the membrane? Like there are, according to Shapsey, he would like to give a Mercedes-Benz incision before you dilate, and post-operatively, he suggests we put mitomycin. Like even Philip Monier and surgeons like that, they advocate applying mitomycin C on. These incisions will prevent rugged edges while using balloon. Though it gives a clean cut, and on those cuts you can always apply mitomycin C to prevent that fibroblast, exaggerated fibroblastic activity and neoangiogenesis.
Yeah.
Sir, and there is one more question from Dr. Shalu Sharma. She was asking whether any imaging was needed. As you mentioned earlier.
Not really.
Not really required. Gold standard.
We can offer a CT and MRI, but I don't see a need of imaging in this case. Usually we do not.
Yes. And if sir, anything to add on the anesthetic considerations, sir?
Yeah. Just adding on to the previous question, MRI would be recommended in case the stenosis is thick and associated cardiac anomalies.
Right.
That would be required. Anomalies or neurological issues, if there are, then you offer imaging.
Yes, sir. Yeah. Sir, any role of swallowing evaluation for laryngomalacia in general? This was a mild case.
I'm sorry, I can't comment on that.
Sir.
Such a young individual swallowing, I don't know how to evaluate.
Can I answer that?
Yes, please, sir.
So primarily there is no proof of any kind of a swallowing issue in the first place.
Yes.
The baby was in the NICU, and of course there will be some amount of whenever there is a laryngomalacia, there is some amount of coexisting pathology in the upper esophageal sphincters as well, and that is why there is a coexisting LPR.
Yes.
And that is the reason why nowadays they are analyzing pepsin in saliva as a surrogate marker for LPR in neonates. Now, the question is, evaluation of swallowing will come much later. Now the child has to breathe. So that you have ensured. And once the baby is transferred to the mother and the baby is unable to latch, or if for some reason the baby is unable to have feeds, then you will probably look into it. But I don't think there is a role for any kind of a feeding evaluation at this point. The other thing I would also like to ask you is, when have you done any check scopies have you done for these?
It's not been even 3 weeks actually.
Okay, so probably it will be a good time to actually do a check scopy. What happens is sometimes there will be some amount of coagulum or something that would form there, which can again cause some kind of a fibrosis. So, once a check scopy would be very gratifying both for you and the parent.
Yeah, 3 weeks we'll plan, sir. It's not 3 weeks, so it is due.
Perfect. I think that's good. I think if there is, I will take your permission to leave.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, Harsha, thank you very much, and very nice discussion, and nice to meet everybody else on this platform. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you.
See you
for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all. I think very nice discussion. Wonderful. Thanks again for inviting me. Ashra and Satya, and wonderful moderation, Dr. Ashish, and thank you so much.
Thank
Sunil. Thank you. See you all then. Bye.
Yeah, bye, sir. Yeah, Harshad, thank you very much. Thanks, Sunil. Thanks, Ashish. Thanks to all the
Sir,
participants.
if I may add just one more point before leaving, sir, don't mind.
Please go ahead.
Sir,
More
this
than
is
happy to
regarding the
listen.
balloon dilatation you were telling. So, like the apex bodies for these pediatric airway surgeries are like one is in Lausanne, that's in Switzerland, and the other one is in Cincinnati,
Okay.
headed by Mark Rutter. So they have an app created for Apple phones, sir. Unfortunately, not for Android, only for Apple. So there you can put in the age and the weight of the child, and few parameters are there. They themselves will give what is the ideal endotracheal tube size and what is the balloon size to be used, and
Yes.
what is the ideal diameter we need to achieve. So, like I've when we discussed this case
Yes.
earlier, I put it in that app, and that app showed it as a 5 mm balloon,
Okay.
and the diameter to be achieved is 7 mm according to the Cincinnati
Great.
institute. So that is one thing I wanted to add, sir.
Yeah. Thank you.
I would like to add a point.
Yes.
Please, sir.
The same app is available for an Android phone also. If anybody wants, I can share it with you.
Oh, is it, sir? I didn't get it, sir. Okay. Thank you for telling me, sir. So, sir, somebody, Dr. Dikshit wants a little elaboration on the consent procedure you use for your cochlear implant, sir. That is probably the last question we'll be taking.
Okay. The consent procedure would be the same as CG consent form. We download the CG consent form from the internet. Okay. There is a separate surgical consent form. There is a separate anesthesia form. Okay. So we follow CG guidelines, and the consent form is available in CG website. Cochlear implant reduction.
Okay. So, how frequently do you do a subglottic dilatation? How many sessions is required? That is
See,
a question.
depends upon the outcome. Okay. If the child is having the symptoms which are very severe, then you go for a repeat dilatation, maybe once or twice, 1 month apart.
Okay. Point for Dr. Tahir Muhammad sir's question. So, because this is a membranous subglottic stenosis, definitely chances of recurrence are less. But if it is a thicker one, probably only one session should be attempted, sir. Subglottic stenosis. If that's not helping, probably you'll have to go for an open procedure like a PCTR.
Exactly.
If it is a thicker and if it is lower down, like if it is beyond 1 centimeter below the vocal cord.
Yeah. If it is quite thick, then we would order for a imaging.
Yes.
And we might go for a open procedure and do a anterior cricoid split and place a cartilage there.
Rib cartilage, yes, sir. Anesthetic considerations during procedures. This was already discussed. I would like to add one point on anesthetic considerations, sir. Like when we were operating in Dinanath Mangeshkar Hospital, there they used to do it without a tube, sir. They used to operate on a high flow nasal oxygen. So they pre-medicate the child, they pre-oxygenate the child. Initially, so total intravenous anesthesia, and then later on when the child is under, we will evaluate the airway. Then they will give a mixture of oxygen and sevoflurane, and that is when we do with a high flow nasal cannula, sir. Around 22 liters per minute is the rate they give, and the child usually tolerates, sir, beyond what is usual. That we get enough time to do one step at least at a time in the supraglottoplasty.
So you wait till what level of SpO2 fall before you stop?
Sir, 90, sir.
90. Okay. The
90 to
international
85
standard
is the
is
time. Yes.
92 or 90. That's okay.
90, 92 is fine, sir. Below 90, the anesthetists will get a little
Yeah.
worried,
See,
then they'll start.
if the
putting in the-
anesthetist is good enough, then even you can just
Depends,
go
sir.
down to 80s also. That's not a
Yes,
problem.
yes. Depends,
So,
depends on that.
it depends on the anesthetic team. Yeah.
Yes, yes. Sir, Dr. Dikshit RM wants to know your take on lasers for the same supraglottoplasty.
So laser would be a good option, CO2 laser or any what do you call
Fiber transmissible
fiber,
KTP laser.
yeah, any laser which can be delivered with a fiber will also be good.
It's
It's a preference and
preference surgeon again. Absolutely, sir. So,
So my question is to Dr. Sunil Goyal. Like I'm Dr. Abha, so I just want to ask him, like in army, how many cases of subglottic stenosis are they getting, and how successful they are to decannulate the patient?
From our experience at RR Hospital in the past 2 years, we must have seen around 3 to 4 cases in the last 2 years. And the treatment depends on the type of stenosis, as I already discussed. If it's a membranous, they do very well, of course. And if it is a cartilage stenosis, we go for Cricoid split or partial endothelial reconstruction. And so far, we have been able to achieve decannulation in all of our patients.
That's great, sir. Thank you, sir.
yeah, Harsha, can we wrap this up or do you have any questions? Harsha?
Hello. Yes, sir.
Yeah.
We have come to end of Q&A session. It was a great talk, sir, Dr. Satyakiran, sir. Really, I think we had a lot of active participation today, and I'm glad people have learned some good take-home messages from two very rare cases. I won't say cochlear implant is a rare, but it is a interesting case of youngest cochlear implantation done in India. We congratulate you, sir. Thank you once again for presenting two cases, and I thank the moderators, Dr. Ashish and Dr. Sunil Goyal, sir, for accepting my invitation at short notice and for joining us. Sir, and you have any closing message, sir, before we?
One thing, see, laryngomalacia is said to be a softer larynx. Actually, it's not the case. The cartilages in laryngomalacia are not soft. So they are the same as consistency of that of normal. The word soft larynx is not actually correct. Agree on that, Ashish?
absolutely, sir. Histologically, there is actually a paper where they didn't find much
Distinction.
evidence histological changes. And one more thing, it is not very common in prematures. Had
Yes.
it been because of immature larynx, it would have been more common in premature babies. But
Yes.
laryngomalacia we see more often in a term child. That also goes against that concept of soft larynx, sir.
Yes. Harsha, can you tell?
Yes, sir. I think can. Sir. Thank you, all the participants. We would like to end the session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Harsha. Thank you, Satya sir. Thank you, Sunil Goyal sir.
And
Thanks,
thank you.
Sunil. Thanks,
Bye.
Harsha.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashish. Good job.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Bye. May I log off?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.